Today I've got a fairly quick one for you. Here we're looking at the game Witchblood. It's available now for £6 or $8 on the Oculus store, and it's available on GearVR. Witchblood is, according to the devs, a 6+ hour long Metroidvania game, based around exploration and combat. There's 40 upgrades to get, and 4 difficulties to master. If you're not familiar with what a Metroidvania is, and you probably are familiar, they're basically 2D games where each room exists on a vertical grid. Your progress through the world is usually limited by your physical strengths and special abilities. Each time you gain a new power, you'll progress not only through the linear path to the end, but you'll also be able to access things in previous areas that you couldn't access before. Good Metroidvanias are the ones that make you feel like you're not spending loads of time going back and forth in a collectathon. And they tend to use verticality really well. For example, going from a dark castle into the depths of hell, or up into the clouds. This is in contrast with most platformers typically focusing primarily on horizontal movement. So, how does Witchblood do? Well, I've got to be fair here. For the asking price, Witchblood is a bloody reasonable way to spend an evening. Maybe 2. At a stretch, 3, depending on your playstyle. But it's not all roses. The premise is very simple. You play an innocent, young girl who initially looks like something out of The Sound of Music. At the very start of the game, your father's killed in front of you by some witch hunter types, and you're saved by something magical. You'll quickly realise that you're able to harness magical powers, and you're going to have to get your hands dirty dispatching a variety of magical monsters and humans. There's also a good chunk of platforming between you and your goal, which is of course to seek revenge for your father's death and restore balance. And of course, all of this is in VR. Here the VR implementation is very basic. You can look around using your head to get a better understanding of the area you're in, where you've come from, and where you might want to go. Other than that, looking at the world, there's a pretty nice diorama type effect for the whole game, and you can control Witchblood with either your Xbox controller or your touch controllers used as a gamepad. So this is definitely one for when you want to kick up your feet and enjoy something in a casual way. The VR is a worthwhile addition. Whilst it's very modest, it's still a nice way of increasing immersion by letting you look around naturally and blocking out reality. When combined with VR, this game is definitely charming to look at. In general, the environments are visually varied and there's a good deal of depth and character that comes through.
I'm out. Fresh air. Just don't look down.
Especially the shadows and the nice way they've handled drawing brickwork and wood all results in something very visually appealing. There isn't much in the way of ugly or lazier looking textures either. Another nice thing is the way that pieces of wood or stones or tables will impose themselves into the frame that every scene sits within. I don't think the portals look great, but they do their job, and the whole approach they took definitely helps create that diorama feel, even at times making it feel like a neat pop-up book. That said, some of the enemy models do look dated rather than stylized, some effects didn't really fit in, and some animations, like the wolves attacking, just missed the mark with me by lacking impact and character. Next up is the sound, which is pretty much on par with the visuals. The sounds are all okay, the swipes and groans of combat are all par for the course, the music in the background is nice, but there really isn't very much of it. It feels like there's maybe 3 generic themes that you'll hear throughout. I felt like I'd already heard the final boss music the first time I'd encountered it, and that's not really a good sign. There is occasional voice acting to progress the story, which is good quality for such a cheap title. However, the script really lets it down.
I wonder what this room is for.
Despite the main character probably having the best voice acting, it felt very generic, and almost like an afterthought at times.
Papa, why didn't you tell me about this? Because of Mother. What in the world is this?
It was the worst thing in the game, and it felt jarring that less than 2 hours after seeing her dad die, not having a minute to stop, she blurts out, "I miss Dad." It just felt out of place. This is made more absurd by the fact that she's getting healed by his ghost hugs every few minutes. The same can be said for the voiced enemies of the game, with one boss in particular feeling like it was voiced by the dev's mate, rather than people with an interest in voice acting. It felt like a weak attempt at trying to create an emotional investment at times, and could have been easily improved without throwing any money at the situation, just some basic attention to detail.
The townsfolk, my friends, they've all turned against me.
The movement in Witchblood is really solid, with things like jump height and an air jump being unlocked as you go. The moving, turning and jumping were all fine and never seemed to impede me. combat, however, is very basic. You have a weapon that you can hit things with, and you gradually get better at melee in two ways. The first is by finding better weapons, from a stick to a sword to a fancier sword and so on, and the other way is by finding power-up statues that grant you knowledge of combat. You'll learn to jump and attack at the same time, and you'll learn to string multiple attacks into a flurry. Unfortunately, at least half of the enemies were just not very fun to fight. Whilst I said the movement is solid, it's fairly rigid and slow. Your character isn't a ninja or anything, so it makes sense. It's realistic. However, when combined with enemies like wolves and jumping frogs, I found that combat in general wasn't hugely enjoyable. Oh, and people with projectiles in this game are the worst. Again, this game is a throwback, so you could say that this is by design, because Castlevania sure as hell feels clunky by today's standards. Personally, I think that's a lame excuse. Also, some of the hitboxes from enemies lingered way too long and were just too big. So on more than one occasion, I was hurt by running into an immobile weapon or by weaponized air. All things considered, the enemies' attack types just aren't the most engaging. There's also a lot of enemies, so it did feel a bit like a war of attrition. Thankfully, for each zone, when you kill an enemy, they won't respawn until you enter another zone. So if you really just want to power through, you can do that with relative ease and hopefully grab some nice upgrades in the next area. In addition to weapon upgrades, you'll find new armor, increase your health and mana, and get new spells to use your mana on. The spells are what you'd expect thematically, some fire, ice, wind and spooky magic. I only really found myself using two types of magic, and that was either to trivialize combat by freezing dudes, or to bypass combat altogether. Maybe I didn't utilize all my magic to the fullest, but it really wasn't necessary on normal mode. The upgrades were one of the most compelling aspects of the game. Getting my hands on more advanced combat capabilities, fancier looking armor and weapons was always a positive experience. However, the pool just wasn't there for me to go seeking these things out after about 45 minutes. I wasn't struggling with the game in general, and it took me less than 2 hours to beat. That said, my 2 hours was spent mostly beelining for the end. I did die a fair amount on a normal setting, in part due to my under-equippedness at times, so really it probably balances out. I'd expect people taking their time to average maybe around 3 hours. The final boss took me about 20 minutes worth of attempts because of my lack of upgrades, and if I'd taken my time to seek out all the upgrades and gain additional powers, I think the final boss would have felt more like the end of Majora's Mask if you go in as a fierce deity. Not something I wanted. As for the difficulty modes, the harder difficulty mode makes you get hurt considerably more with every hit, and makes enemies take a hit or so more on average, meaning you'll definitely want to find the upgrades wherever possible. I'd recommend this difficulty to people who want to take the time to methodically go through and find everything, assuming you're at least okay at platformers. Extreme mode means that if you die, you don't just respawn. You go back to the last daddy hug statue and lose all progress. I don't think this game is compelling enough that anyone should want to torture themselves with this mode. I think that's a bit of an unrealistic expectation. At the end of the day, the thing I have to come back to is the price. Nothing about this game is amazing, but I still did enjoy it. For the price, it's a fine game. However, I think the fact you can play it on GearVR says something to the quality and depth that you can expect. Whilst I'd imagine it's one of the best things you can play on GearVR, the highs are just much higher on PC or PSVR. This is a good intro game to the genre, but for anybody who's played good Metroidvanias, there really isn't a lot here for you. Unless you're a big sap for indie games like me, or have rose-tinted goggles about everything VR still. So I recommend Witchblood for anyone who hasn't got much Metroidvania experience. It's certainly a good game, but I'd struggle to call it a gem. If you take away the gloss of VR, it's a fairly superficial effort. That sounds a bit harsh, but when you take into account the generic but thematically cool story, and the at times obligatory feeling dialogue, what you're left with is just an okay game, made better by the expensive device strapped to your face. I don't think that anybody would be raving about this game if it just appeared on Steam in non-VR, even for £6. The reviews would still be positive, but no way 5 stars positive. That's all. Thanks for watching. Let me know what you think. If you want to see more in-depth, honest VR reviews, then make sure you're subscribed. Leave a like if you like this video, and I'll see you next time.